to today's episode of Cheap Shots, 4 more 24mm lenses examined. I'm telling you, you're in for a couple of surprises today. You know, last year I put together my first comparison video examining performance of 4 vintage 24mm lenses in a few different real-world scenarios. If you haven't watched it, check it out. We looked at the SuperTAC 2435, a TX-mounted Vivitar made by Tokina, and the well-regarded Olympus OM 24.8, and the lens that many felt really won that battle, the Minolta 24mm F2.8. Well, this time I've got 4 more vintage 24mm lenses, and for the sake of continuity, I'm going to compare them to that same Minolta lens that really did great. I picked up all these lenses at bargain prices, but even if I paid full retail, the 4 new ones I'm looking at today are less expensive than the Minolta MD 2428 that won the last battle. And believe it or not, as a surprise twist, I'm even throwing in a vintage zoom into the mix. Let's meet our contenders. First up, that zoom lens I was just talking about. It's the same vintage as the MD 2428 that's so well regarded and purported to be a Leica design. But can a vintage zoom compare to a vintage prime, especially an older one that goes all the way down to 24 millimeters? Well, we'll see. A little bit about this gem. It's the Minolta 24-35 f3.5. Vintage collectors are well aware of the 24-50 Minolta wide-angle zoom. It's highly regarded and covers a very useful focal length on both full-frame cameras and APS-C cameras as well. But this one is a little less well known. While it doesn't cover quite as large a focal range, it's slightly faster, and at a constant f3.5, it's a small lens, very compact, not much bigger than a fast 50. It replaces a 24, a 28, and a 35. In its day, back in the early 80s, this was an impressive lens. But conventional wisdom says anything that's a vintage zoom lens from the early 80s is going to be subpar, right? I can't wait to see for sure. The next lens in the lineup is a CPC Phase 2. I picked this guy up for about $10, a real bargain for any lens that's in good shape, and this one is. Some believe that CPC Phase 2 was a Pentax white-labeled brand. I'm not sure, but if you have any history on the manufacturer or thoughts on who you think it may be, let us know in the comments. Like the others, this is a small lens, 52mm ring, filter ring. It's a total wild card. I haven't tried it before, and I couldn't find any reviews on it, so we'll just have to see how well it holds up against the name brand competition. Next up, we've got a pretty well-known gem of a lens that was manufactured by Komin for Vivitar. Also a 52mm filter thread. It's an improbably small lens that gets all the way down to f2. This particular lens came to me as part of a lot of Nikon gear. And from what I could tell by checking prices online, they probably sell for about $100. It's still a bargain compared to a modern, fast, wide-angle prime. There are probably at least 2 versions of this lens out there, one made by Chiron, the other by Komine. Each purportedly has their own merits. People think one is better than the others. Knowing how Vivitar used both of those manufacturers as well as Tokina to make a lot of their greatest lenses, I'm not surprised that that's the case. A lot of keyboard connoisseurs swear by this lens. Let's see how it behaves in some real-world shooting opportunity. Finally, the only 24mm I actually sought out to buy on purpose. If you can't tell from my channel, I like coming across lenses in my travels and trying them out. There's a small handful of lenses, though, that I've used at some point or another and found them to be such good performers that I try to keep them no matter what I'm using. You may have heard of the Sigma Super Wide 2 24mm f2.8. I love that lens, and I love this lens even more because this is the rebranded sibling, the Quantaray Tech 10 24mm f2.8. That's right, the Quantaray 24 is the same as the Sigma and can often be found even cheaper. Imagine that, a sleeper lens that has a less well-known rebranded version. I call that a deep sleeper. I ran across this lens in an autofocus version when I shot Pentax DSLRs back, well, I guess it was probably around 2008. I couldn't believe how good it was. When I switched to Nikon, it was a no-brainer to pick up as one of the first lenses I got in that system as well. And it had the benefit of being cheaper than virtually any other 24 millimeter autofocus Nikon lens out there. I was pleased when I discovered there was a manual version of this lens, and I owned it for a while when I was getting into manual focus. But eventually I sold that version as 2 and replaced it with the current specimen, which is in perfect shape. For less than $40 on eBay, will it hold up against some of the more expensive lenses from first-party manufacturers? Well, what are we waiting for? Let's find out. Here we have a nice architectural shot example. This is an historic mill and a 24 millimeter f2.8 quant array, which if you've watched my other video on 24 millimeter lenses, you'll hear me say that this is the lens that I always own. So here on the left hand side I've got that lens. On the right hand side I have a no-name brand. It's called Phase 2, also 24 millimeter f2.8. So looking initially, you can see a fair amount of vignetting on the quant array side. If we zoom in into the middle of the screen, this is the point of focus for me. You can see they're both very, very sharp. Maybe the quant array is slightly warmer in appearance. If we start to move over into the second third of the screen, still pretty sharp on both sides. I think this Phase 2 is really holding up well. And here I'm looking at the cones, the orange cones. You can start to see that the quant array is holding up, but the Phase 2 here is starting to get a little bit blurry, a little muddy, especially here in the extreme corners. A good example of this would be, look at the difference between the bark on this tree, between these two examples. Now let's compare the quant array. Again, this is wide open, f2.8. Let's compare it to our next lens, which is the Vivitar quant array here on the left, also at 2.8. The Vivitar is an interesting lens because it stops all the way down to f2. And if we look at it at f2, you can see quite a bit more vignetting. It's kind of an ethereal, ghosty rendition. At 2.8 it gets a little bit better, and these are both pretty sharp lenses in the center. In fact, maybe the Vivitar at 2.8 is even sharper. However, if I start to move down again toward the extremes, you can see the Vivitar maybe not quite as sharp. If we move into the corners, again, big difference here. It's, just a really, really big difference here in the corner. So the Vivitar sharp in the center, not nearly as sharp in the corners. And this is a really interesting comparison. On the left-hand side, we've got, again, that quant array. On the right side now, we're adding in the Minolta MD 24 millimeter f2.8. For those of you who watched my previous video on 24 millimeter lenses, you'll know that this lens was the top performer compared to 3 other lenses that we looked at. This is a very interesting comparison to me because I know this Minolta is a top performer. This lens goes for several $100s. This quant array here on the left hand side I picked up for about 40 bucks. Let's zoom in to the center. Again, you can see this Minolta very, very sharp. Not surprising. I might give it a little bit of an edge. Again, maybe slightly cooler. If we go down into the corners, into the extreme, you can see that here the cones are also very, very sharp. In the absolute extreme corner, though, I think the quant array is really even stronger. Look at the difference here. Could just be focus a little bit, or again, the Minolta looking pretty good in the lower left corner. The upper right corner, though, I think I had to give it to the quant array. So you can see upper left corner, very, very equal lenses. In fact, if I look at the quant array, let's get it down to f11, and on the right side here, let's look at the Minolta Prime at f11. Both of these just super, super sharp. I think the Quantum though is even sharper here in that upper right corner. Hard to tell elsewhere. You know, in the left corner, lower left, I think they're very, very equal. You can see that Quantum is doing a great job. Not so much aberration either. All right, so I'm going to go back to F2.8 on the Quantum, and on the right side, I'm going to show our next lens. You can see that there's vignetting on both of these wide open. But the lens on the right here is also a Minolta lens, also at 24 millimeters, but this is a pretty rare zoom lens. It's the Minolta MD 24 to 35 millimeter. Many of you have heard of the 24 to 50. This is the 24 to 35. It is a small lens. It is not much bigger than any of the other primes. But how does a vintage zoom hold up to one of the, a top performing vintage prime? Well, pretty darn good. I think, again, compared to that Quantum, which I'm calling sort of the winner in this test so far, very, very good. Look at the lack of aberration and the tightness on this antenna here. You know, as we scroll down, you could really see some detail in these rocks. If I zoom out, you know, not much more distortion, nothing terribly visible. If I zoom into the corners here, look at that. This is wide open. Now, it is a 3.5 lens versus a 2.8 lens, but wide open. I think those cones are even sharper here. Maybe not quite as sharp in the upper right corner, but I think this is the lens that gives that Quantum the most run for the money in the very, very extreme. Lower left, maybe not quite as sharp, blurring out a little bit on the lower left, but that is an impressive showing for a vintage zoom lens. Now for this test, I want to take a look at some of the macro capabilities. How close can these lenses focus? And 3 are in the same range, and 1 is different from the other. If you remember, it's like Sesame Street. Which one is different from the other? And there is a clear difference here. We have that Quantum. I may have mentioned before, it's a Sigma-made 24mm f2.8 branded Quantum, which was an old Ritz camera store brand. And on the right-hand side, we happen to have the Phase 2. And just before I zoom in, this is the major difference between these two lenses, and quite frankly, this Quantum and every other competitor I've shot with. It gets close. This is one of the reasons why I always keep one of these around. You can see razor thin depth of field at that distance. Both of these are shot wide open. The Phase 2, it's a no-name brand. It's cheapy, but it's nice and sharp, even wide open. Has a pleasant rendering, but very, very different between the two. Let me just mention this next lens is very, very different. This is the Vivitar F2, and none of the other lenses get down to F2, which I think is an important consideration. It's pretty soft, but it has a very special rendering, almost ethereal. Bringing them both to F2 is a little bit more of a fair comparison. Again, though, this Vivitar looks almost like that Phase 2. We could zoom in, but just a very, very big difference. Nothing wrong with this Vivitar lens, but it is just different. Next lens that I want to look at here on the right side is going to be the Minolta Zoom wide open. This one doesn't quite, this is probably the farthest focusing, but look at, not that big of a difference compared to. So here it is, wide, little vignetting, but very nice rendering lens. Look how nice and sharp it is in the middle. Right, 3.5 gives you a little bit extra depth of field. This nut up here in the upper right is starting to come into focus. And then our last item to look at is the Minolta prime lens. So again, this is on the left hand side a $40 lens, on the right hand side a couple $100, And, even though that Minolta is a great lens, it's nice and sharp in the middle, no contest in this particular matchup. I'm going to take the Minolta down to F8 to really show what it looks like. It gets rid of all that vignetting. Much more is in focus. On the left-hand side, I'm going to do the same with the Quantaray. Again, zooming in, you're going to see super sharp on the Quantaray. You're going to begin to start to get some little more depth of field. But the Minolta, again, sharp across, just major difference in how close these two lenses can focus. On the left-hand side, we've got that Minolta Prime F2.8 wide open, and on the right we have that Minolta Zoom F3.5 also wide open. And just going to start with the general scene here, comparing them, pretty similar. See some vignetting. You see, again, I lack of contrast to a degree, but in the scene itself, which I think is sometimes helpful. My focal point was, again, middle of the frame, looking here, the roof of this home, and maybe a little bit sharper, maybe a touch more contrast here on the zoom side, which again is just absolutely flabbergasting to me. A little bit more detail on the siding of that house, comparing. I mean, they're both really sharp in the center, of course, but that zoom is just incredible in terms of its performance, in my opinion. As we move toward the a third of the way out from center, still seeing really good contrast here. Looking at the some of the molding work, you can see some detail here. Look at the bricks on the zoom side versus the prime side. I think the zoom is still, if anything, sharper even into the corners at infinity in the distance. You can see a tiny bit sharper maybe here on the exhaust pipes out there. You can see, look at the detail in the bridge, a little bit more contrast, a little bit more detail on the zoom side. And I think it holds up here toward the edge, and toward the corners here. Maybe the prime is a little bit tighter here. It could be, decentering, something along those lines, but the prime in the left hand side looks a little bit stronger to me in the extreme corner. The zoom looks a little bit stronger to me in the extreme corner on the right hand side. Next lens I'd like to again compare to this Minolta Prime on the left hand side, which was our winner in the previous review that we did, the Quantaray. Now again, Quantaray, it's a Sigma originally, it was rebranded Quantaray to be sold for Ritz camera. These are incredibly cheap. Because of that, Quantaray lenses are typically not that great, but the Tech 10 varieties are rebranded pretty good third-party lenses, and this is an outstanding lens. I think if anything, the Quantaray a little bit better contrast here in the foreground. I'm going to zoom into the focal point here. It's hard to tell. Like the others, maybe you have a touch more contrast on the Minolta side. As we move out into toward the edges, I think as we get even to the corners, I feel like the Quantaray wide open 2.8, to me, it's sharper. Right? Look at the difference here. Look at the difference in the detail on the exhaust pipes here on the roof. The Minolta was a top performer in the previous test in the corners, wide open. It was still sharp, but I think the Quantaray is even sharper. Let's look on the left-hand side. Again, look at the difference in the bricks. And even in the extreme edge, I have to give it to the Quantaray. What an outstanding performance by that lens. That is a bargain lens that outperforms. We're going to look at the Vivitar. Again, same kind of eerie, ethereal, wide open look. Stop down to 2.8, much sharper. Like before, sharp in the center.
In the other tests, it did not fare that well in the corners, and you can see as we move out to the edge, I'm starting to see degradation. Significant here, big difference, and in the extreme corners, not even close. Clearly the same on the left-hand side. And, if we needed to get this Vivitar to the same, here, I'll put it in here at F5.6, it then, overtakes the Minolta at 2.8. So, I mean, again, the Vivitar, if you're able to stop it down a little bit, not a bad lens. On the right-hand side, it's maybe not doing as well. Even at f11 on the right-hand side, you're still not quite as good as the Minolta is wide open. Again, that's why I have to look at these on a case-by-case basis. Left side's better than the right, etc., etc. Now I'm going to be looking on the right-hand side at the Phase 2. This was the cheapest lens. Wide open, here's the cheapest lens of the bunch, 10 bucks. Compared on the left side to the most expensive lens of the bunch. Unless you start pixel peeping, not a whole heck of a lot of difference there. And even if we do pixel peep in the center of the frame, very, very close. Basically the same in my opinion. Detail holds up in the first third. May even be slightly better on the Phase 2. Really holds up all the way until you get into the extreme corner, and that's where the Minolta takes it over. Maybe even sharper than the Minolta. But once you get to the extreme edge, the Minolta is tough to beat. If we went to the Phase 2, here it is at 5.6. Maybe there it finally catches it. So unless you have to shoot wide open, even the Phase 2 gives you some really good corner sharpness. Here it is again at 5.6. You can see it's really sharp. On the left-hand side, I just want to, just for the heck of it, I'm going to put the Vivitar up. Yeah, Vivitar is the one lens that just doesn't give corner-to-corner sharpness. It does get down to f2, but it just doesn't give you that corner-to-corner sharpness, even at f11. But I'll tell you, I bet the Quantarray, if we brought that in, again, here's that Quantarray at f2.8 on the left-hand side versus that Phase 2 at 5.6. If we brought the Quantarray down to 5.6, you'll see that it is, darn sharp. So Phase 2, great lens on the cheap as well, especially if you could stop it down. Quantarray, in my opinion, best of the bunch.
So what does it all mean? First off, I'm blown away by the performance of the Minolta zoom lens at the wide end. The fact that it zooms up to 35 millimeters makes it like carrying 3 primes in a package that's not much bigger than 1. The CPC Phase 2, it's compact, sharp in the center from wide open, and I think just a dandy lens if you come across one at a good price. The lens really sharpens up as you stop it down, but it's still very usable and one I would buy without any hesitation. The Vivitar opens up to f2. In the old days, this would have been a boon because lenses stopped down before shooting and the wider aperture made for a brighter viewfinder. Stop down even a little bit, it becomes very sharp in the center. Unfortunately, it never really sharpens up in the corners, even at f11 or 16. Does the Minolta Prime hold up as the top performing lens of the 8 I've tested? Well, it's sharp to the corners, even wide open. It deals with flare and glare well, and it has a pleasing rendering with good contrast and color. If I could keep just one, I give the nod to the Quantarray or Sigma Super Wide 2. This lens is just a beast. It's sharp corner to corner, even wide open, just like the Minolta. The close focus capabilities. It gets down to 1.4 macro, and that's something that these other lenses just can't touch. It's like having a whole other lens in your bag when you bring it along with you, and the others simply just can't do that. So in addition to being one of the best lenses in terms of sharpness, having good character, decent contrast, the macro capabilities really take it over the top. This is the vintage 24 to get. I realize that I came in a little biased to start with, and as always, remember, we're dealing with vintage lenses here. That means condition and sample variation can contribute to these results, so take them with a grain of salt. Adapters are different, though in this case I shot most of these except for the Vivitar and Quantre with the same adapter, all Minolta mounts. Yes, I'd love to try some night cores. That's primarily what I collect, but I simply haven't come across any in my travels at the 24mm focal length. And I hear that the Canon FDs are great too, but hey, who says we can't have an episode 3 of these vintage 24 comparisons? Here's my ranking. First off, if I have to keep with one, it's the Sigma Quantre as I mentioned. Then, of course, the Minolta MD 24 and F2.8. Third, if I'm just looking at pure results, I give it to the Olympus OM 24-8, just barely edging out that relative 24-35 f3.5 zoom lens. After that, there's a Tokina made Vivitar that was in the Vivitar TX mount. It was great, very sharp from the center, very unique and interesting in the rendering. It's a toss-up between that one and the CPC Phase 2 24 that I looked at this time. Great lenses once they were stopped down just a little bit. After that, I'd have to rank the Vivitar takumar at F2. It's a great lens, it's good down to F2, but never really sharpens up the f1. Super takumar, never sharpened up the f1 even the first day. That's that sharp. Interesting rendering though, and there's a place where you can hit and I like that. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Shots. Please like and subscribe if you appreciate the effort and like to see more. Get after it.